Okay. Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So it'll be, because it's now, we're about 40 minutes past 4, so we'll be a little bit shorter than 2 hours, but I do want to answer your questions. I'm going to give a broad overview. I have 7 points to go over, and then you can certainly interrupt me if you have a question if something's not clear. Okay. So Main Lesson actually did not come in the very first training for teachers. When Steiner was approached, do you know much about the history of how the school was developed?
I do.
Yeah, so when he first trained the teachers, those first 2 weeks, they had 3 lectures a day. Well, actually 2 lectures and then a conversation in the afternoon, in the sort of evening time. And they did that for 2 weeks straight. And then he opened the school. And at the beginning, the teachers were given a sense of why we're teaching this particular way and how to teach. But the Main Lesson developed out of the practice. It got started, and then he was like, things need to be adjusted. And the wonderful thing about the first Waldorf school was that Steiner was there, living, engaged, involved, creating the faculty meetings, answering their questions, visiting the classes, talking to the teachers and the children. The children loved him. And so he always was modifying what he had said in the first 2 weeks, and someone also took notes during his faculty meetings, and so any of the things that he shared later were also then shared with teachers as they, so I took the training, I read the 2 weeks worth of lectures, and then I continue to read. I mean, you can't stop learning about it. But in the first 2 weeks, the first lecture of the first 2 weeks, Steiner talks about the importance of sleep. And sleep as more of a principle of being awake to something and then letting it rest. And then being awake to something and letting it rest. And so our consciousness awakens when the sun shines, and then it goes to sleep when it goes to sleep when we go to sleep, when we lay our head on the pillow. And during the sleeping time is actually a very important integration period that happens for all of us. We take in the experiences from the day, and then sometimes we don't remember everything because we're zooming from one thing to the next. But in our sleep, we actually can process it in our consciousness, in our unconsciousness. And so Steiner used that as a tool. I mean, he says this on the very first day, that this is the most important aspect of Waldorf education, is that we recognize that a child needs sleep in order to understand and grow their thinking capacities over time. And so the teacher will always have that in their minds whenever they're preparing anything, is that there's a feeling of, I'll work on this for a while, and then I'll let it go to sleep. And then I'll work on this for a while, and then I'll let it go to sleep. So the principle of the block, which we can talk about individually, because different children at different ages, they have these different block arrangements. But a block is a period of time where you focus intently on a certain subject, and then you let it go. And then you come back to it later in the year, after the child had gathered other experiences, so that when you bring the lesson back again, teaching the same subject, they now have some things to connect it to. And so then you can enrich it and enliven it and bring it more to mastery in the second time. So it's through the remembering of, well, what did we do the last block? Let's bring it forward and build on that understanding, because we've had other experiences that might modify our perceptions, modify our understandings. And so those rhythms, those are monthly rhythms that he has, a monthly block rhythm. So every month you change to a new subject and you let the old subject go to the best of your ability. Sometimes the children's interest will bring it up again, but you want to let that, you aren't going to be teaching specifically on that topic. And then you'll come back to it half year later. The weekly rhythm is working with the topic at different levels of understanding. So I look at the human body, often of the body, soul, and spirit, or Steiner talks about the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the ego body. And how can you approach the topic that you're working at from those different perspectives? So when you have the physical body, you're talking about the stuff of the experience. So third grade, your son is in third grade, right? Second grade. Okay, so let me think of an example for second grade. So second grade, you're doing some nature stories. And if you're doing a whole block on nature stories to explore the world and learn about the things that go on there, the first week you might focus specifically on the things that we see and can touch. Rocks, stones, the trees and things. We identify all of those different things. We name and label them and know what their relationships are to each other. Then the second level is the etheric level, is how do things change over time? So in our etheric body, which is our life body, it is the part of us that changes and grows and makes us healthy and makes us feel alive. So what in nature is alive? You know, so you talk with the children about the seasons. They never are the same. They're always changing. You talk about the weather. You can talk about the flowing of the waters and how the water goes back up into the sky and comes back down as rain, or it goes down the river and it ends up in the ocean, and stories that can give you a sense of flow and movement. That's the etheric realm. And then in the astral experience, you can then focus on the animals and the different kinds of animals that you come across in nature and what they're like. So you might tell a story about squirrel, and you tell a story about rabbit, and you tell a story about snail, and you tell a story about bird. And so then they get a feeling for this astral, which is more emotional, more animal part of ourselves. And then the last part of this block, you can talk about the human, the ego, what makes us most human, and our relationship to nature. And then you could talk even at a second grade level about caring for our earth, caring for the things that are around us. What is our relationship to nature? How can we be more engaged? And you could even talk about ecology at a second grade level. And you can talk about global warming at a second grade level. And you can talk about you can talk about those experiences that the children have, where the media sometimes gives them words and language that they don't really understand, but you can give them context. And that's really what Waldorf does, is it gives them a lot of context by starting with the basic and building understanding as you go through the period of the blocks. So looking specifically at the day, the rhythms of the day, so those were the rhythms of the month and the rhythms of the week, sleeping and waking. So you would then in the day, you would have things that you do every day, but there's the sleep in between. You only talk about it for a little bit of time, and then you let it go until tomorrow, and you come back again. And so that is the three parts of the main lesson, are the storytelling, the retelling, and the doing in the workbook of some kind. Let me go back a little bit. when you talk about the circle time, a lot of people get confused about what is circle, why do we have circle, what is it for? As a child moves from early childhood into the grade school, their consciousness changes and they're able to think in a new way, but this new thinking comes very gradually, bit by bit. In the early childhood, their thinking and their work that they were doing was playing. And their playing is moving. They're moving all the time. Teachers are creating opportunities for them to play, making opportunities for them to work and to do things. And their thinking that goes on in their head is making sure that they're doing what they should be doing, or playing the game that they want to play, or talking to their friend about the thing they want to talk about, or doing a puppet show. There isn't a lot of intellectual thinking. It's more of a doing thinking, right? So when a child moves into first grade, we don't want to too quick get them into intellectual thinking. We still need them to be doing a lot of doing thinking. So that's the role that the circle plays, is that there are conscious movement activities, playing games that are conscious related to your topic, math or about nature, games with songs, getting to know their body because their body is growing, and also interacting with their friends. So songs with dance, songs with movement, poems with movement, identifying body parts with, stretching. We like to do some stretching. We do hand clapping games, circle movements, things like that. In the first grade, a long part of the main lesson is circle time. Because that's where they're doing their thinking, is still in their moving. The part that's awakening in them, their first ability that it can begin to have is memory. And so memory is very important for intellectual thinking, which is coming later, but we work on the memory, first, second, third grade, most specifically on telling a story and having them retell it the next day. So the rhythm is we tell the story and then we let it go. And then the next day they come back and then they have to retell it to us. What was the story about? What happened in the story? Can they sequence it? Can they know about the character from what was happening? Can there be an opportunity for them to enter into that experience of that character? They might do a little play, or different children play dress up and they can act it out. But you want, through your story, when you tell the story, you want to create enough of an imaginary picture in their head through your descriptions and your emotions that you put into the story, that they then overnight take that in deeply into their being. And then when they wake up and they come to school the next day and you sort of tap on the door and you say, come out, they then create that picture again in their head, and your job is to help them articulate it through words. Memory is memory until it's actually spoken. And that's the hard work most of the time, is that getting them to actually articulate what they remember in a way that is understandable by the other students and by you. So in the first and second grade, that's really your hard work, because a lot of children don't want to say, because mom knows, why do you need me to tell you what you already told me? You already know the story. But the reality is you want them to begin to express themselves in a way where they're understood and have their own voice. Because if they can't speak what lives in their imagination, later on in third and fourth and fifth grade, they're not going to be able to write what's in their imagination. So this articulation process is really super important.
So how do you bring that out?
Yeah.
Questions, games, role playing, more questions. You start the story, they tell a part of the story. You tell part of the story, they tell part of the story. You have to be creative.
Valentina will tell me the story, but it won't have that much detail. How do you get them to give more detail?
Ask questions. You tell me that the girl is pretty. What do you mean by pretty? What did you imagine in your mind? Was she wearing something? What was her hair like? Try to be open with your questions, that you're not feeding them the answer, but allowing them to see in their mind. You might even say, go back to the picture in your mind and tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. And what was that like? And what did she say? And how did she feel? And then they begin to put themselves in the story, and they can then answer more fully. Once you recall, you can then tell a new story that's related to the first story. Again, context is everything. You will be more successful as a teacher of your child if you give them context. So the new story, you want to give them a seed that they can plant in the ground of the last story, if possible. Or a story maybe that you told the week before. Do you remember when I told you that story about Susie, who had that problem, or Susie who went on that adventure? The character, I'm going to tell you about Johnny, and he had a similar adventure, or he also felt the same way about this certain circumstance, so that they can live in the imagination that was so rich from before and then build a new imagination out of it. Or you have to start the story so full of imagery by describing what you see in your mind that they can immediately enter into it. One of the things that I think we were talking about before was that sometimes if they have so many questions, if they interrupt you, it's because they're not yet able to create a picture. So you have to slow down, not gallop towards the end of the story. And that's kind of nerve-wracking, because as you've prepared your story, you want to tell it, right? But the child, if they can't enter into it, they'll continue to interrupt you. So you have to either find context that they can slip into, or you need to build the picture more vividly in your own mind and describe it.
Can you read a book to them?
You can read a book to them.
They can't look at the pictures though.
If it's a picture book, it's kind of hard not to show them the pictures, because oftentimes a picture book will only have a few words, and they actually infer a great deal of what's happening in the story from what happens in the images. And being an artist myself and being hired to illustrate words, you're always adding way more into the image than what the words are. So your work as a teacher really is, how do I develop a story where there's an image rather than just words or facts or figures, but to create an experience for them to enter into.
I'm just wondering how, because he's reading, and I'm just wondering how that works with books, right?
Well, books are fine. If he's reading, that's fabulous. I would say have him read as much as possible. But when you are working with him with the topic at hand, whether you're doing saint stories or fables or hero stories or whatever, those stories are separate. that work is work that you have to do in your heart as a gift to him.
Okay.
You want to work with the story, build a picture in your own imagination, and he will drink from you. He will drink from that work that you do. So describing the person's clothes and the personality and how they stand and where they travel to and how that travel is. Like, is it difficult travel? He's not used to walking. His shoes hurt when he goes too far, so he has to sit and rest. And the sun is beating down on his head and he starts to sweat. These kinds of experiences are
pictures and imagery.
very strong in the feeling realm. And so when he arrives at his destination, there's a sense of relief because he finds a nice bench to sit in the shade. And a woman comes out of the house, an old woman, and she's carrying a pitcher. And in that pitcher is the cool water. And as soon as he sees the water, he knows how thirsty he really is. And she points to the bench, and there's a bowl, and he holds the bowl, and she can pour the cool water in it, and he drinks deeply. And he knows that she is good because she cares and is kind. So that kind of imagery is what you want to build. And even just in that interchange, he's drinking in this feeling of what it means to take care of somebody, what it means to be under suffering, how mild it might be with his tight shoes and his sweating brow, but that there is a feeling of entering in to that individuality that you're telling this story about. Because then that interchange, that interaction builds something in the main character who then says, this is how this woman treated me, so that's how I want to treat other people. And that's a real saint story. Someone is transformed by an experience and then gives to humanity in a new way. Because in the past, you might tell the story, in the past he ignored everybody, right? So that those are the pictures that you want to create for them. So that story, then I've told that story, I would then go and let it go. And then the next day, I would say, well, what do you remember about that story? What do you remember about the character in the story? Tell me about the old woman. You sort of prompting him to build that picture in his mind and share. And you'll find that he might even bring parts of the image that you didn't even talk about, but it's in his mind, and that is exciting as a teacher to hear those other things. Well, what was his, you might not even have described his clothes, but you described his shoes, but what was he wearing? He must have been wearing clothes, right? Tell me what they look like in your mind. And so then you begin to really help develop this imaginary language and the ability to describe in words. Because if he's a reader, he's reading everybody else's words. We want to hear his words. And that's in the first 3 years, that's what you want to be developing the most, is his ability to express himself and what is in his mind through words. Because then in second grade, you're developing their writing. And the writing is simple. At first, you give them the writing. But eventually, they'll say, oh, well, I want to write this, or I want to say this about that character. And then you will give them the symbols, the words and the letters to express their words on the paper. Right? So that's your greatest task. And if your stories are simple at the beginning, that's fine.
So I'm creating the stories.
Well, there are lots of great books. Do you have a homeschooling program that you're following?
I'm still getting acquainted.
Okay.
It's my first time.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, but I searched up a number of sites, yes.
Okay, so I think, Tanya, you're using Christophorus, right? Or is it
Live education.
Live education? Okay,
Yes.
so there's different ones.
Okay. I went on the Leah website.
Okay, I don't know that
went
one.
on Easy Peasy Homeschool.
Okay.
Yeah,
Are you interested in doing Waldorf-based homeschool or?
they have that.
Yes, Christophorus is the one that's specifically Waldorf. And there was another one,
Can you spell Christophorus?
Chris,
CRISTOPHER.
Topherus, I think. Christophorus.
Christophorus. Yeah, sounds about
Homeschool.
Waldorf.
Yeah.
For Waldorf?
You could put Waldorf. It will come up in
Yeah.
the Google.
Yeah, I was
And
looking
what
at
you
a
could
couple.
do
It
is-
gets overwhelming.
Yes. Well, if you want to stick with Waldorf, this is a good place
It's
to
a good
start.
comprehensive.
Yep.
Live education is Waldorf also, and it's all little, thin, non-overwhelming books.
Okay.
And it gives you step by step.
So
Yeah.
you write that down and
Which
take a
one
look
is
at that.
that?
Live
Live
education.
Oh,
education.
okay.
And so each block has its own book.
Yes.
And so in
There's
that
one on-
book,
One on fables, one on saints, one on math. The math may be only one book for each of the blocks.
Okay.
It's 6 books and it's very
Okay.
concise.
and so in there, there'll be stories or recommendations of places where you can get good stories.
Okay.
Because there's lots of resources out there that are Waldorf specific.
Mhm.
And I can work with you as well if you're interested in.
I really am.
Okay, that would be great.
Yes.
We can meet and talk and
Okay.
and create a plan for
Okay.
you,
Thank you.
and then you won't feel so overwhelmed.
Yes.
And what can happen then, when I prepared for my teaching, especially with the stories, I would start reading the story 3 or 4 days before I actually told it. And the stories are only like a page or a page and a half long. They're
Mhm.
not like a whole chapter.
Okay.
You're just giving them an image, a
Mhm.
picture. So you read it, you think about it, you sleep on it, you wake up, you read it again, you begin to create,
Mhm.
you create the images that you want, the sort of imaginations that you have, and through that time, it's growing in you.
So you feel it too.
So you begin
see
to
it too.
feel it and you begin to see it, so that when you actually give it to them, the richness of your contemplation is fed into it. And you also will find that there are often principles in the stories that are just right for your child. It's like a teaching moment, like how to be a better human being in these stories. And so then you can give it in a way of, I love you so much, I want you to be a better human.
Right.
And here's a picture that you can enter into and become that person just by trying to behave like the character in the story.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's exciting when you see those things happen.
Mhm.
But these programs, they'll offer you stories, some writing assignments.
Okay.
There's poetry in there as well. So this circle activity time that we were talking about, we'll give you some suggestions for that as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the rhythms here. So this I created this, which you can see, is a weekly schedule, but it's flexible. You don't have to keep regimented in this way, but there's so you tell the story on Monday, and then you let it sleep. And then on Tuesday, you have them recall the story, and then you tell a new story. Or you tell a continuation, part 2 of the story that you started the day before. And on that day, you're going to do your book work for that story that you told on the day before. So they've had a chance to re-enliven that image, and now we're going to make it material in the book.
So draw a picture.
Draw a picture or write a sentence or write 2 sentences. Depends on how quick your child is in doing those things. So there's a sense of, if you think about just the process of thinking, feeling, and willing. So thinking, when you tell the story, they have to think about it. But when they retell the story, they have to feel it again and verbalize it, so that there's this activity that happens in this realm through the vocalization of it. And then through the willing, the actually doing, we're making it real by drawing a picture of the character or their interaction between two characters, or writing a sentence based on what they spoke, so that it's a sentence that comes out of their mouth. They say, what you could say, we're going to write a sentence about this story. What should we write? Can you tell me the story in one sentence? Or tell me the most important part of the story in one sentence. So the old woman gave the young boy a drink of cold water. The old woman gave the young boy a drink of cold water. So 12 words. It's a lot for a second grader.
That is.
And, or you can make a shorter one. The boy traveled far. The woman helped him. You have your principle in there.
Yes.
It's in writing. It's real for him. And then later he can come back and he has in his mind the imagination. He has the picture of the boy on the bench and the woman with the pitcher. And then he has a reading of it. And so then reading is not just the words, it's context. The reading of that sentence has meaning, has deep meaning that has happened over a course of a number of days. Plus your number of days working on it on yourself. All that is crystallized into this one sentence. It's pretty powerful.
It is.
So when he begins to read, I mean, you're telling me that he's quite a reader already, but if you have a student who is not a good reader and they can only read 4 or 5 words at a time, these words mean something.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about Waldorf education teaching reading backwards, we teach context, comprehension first. Then we teach how to sound out the letters. It's backwards compared to what they're doing in the public school.
Yeah.
In the public school, they're telling them how to decipher the symbols. So many students, I hear stories about students who can read whole books and not know what it's about. They can sound it out and read it to the adult, and the adult thinks they can read, but they have no idea what they just
the
read.
comprehension is not there.
It's not there. So we create comprehension, and then they can read the words. And because there's so much comprehension, they pick it up much more quickly. Yeah. So here we have this cycle that happens. There's story, recall, bookwork. 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 So you can carry it over days where the recall is a little bit more difficult because over the weekend they haven't heard the story, but they could be thinking about it a little bit. You might remind them. That's the nice thing because you're with them.
Yeah.
You might remind them, or you might have a circumstance where the story comes up in a dinner table conversation or something. That, oh, that reminds me of that story. Do you remember that story? What was that story? You know, and then they start telling the story because they can own it in a different way. Right? So then story, retelling can, at some point, as he gets older and more confident about expressing himself or herself, then it can be a conversation. And then that experience in the story can bring you out into the world, into experiences that you have of the principles of that story happening in the outside world. Have you ever been someplace where someone gave you something that you wanted, that you didn't even know you wanted until they actually gave it to you? You know, he didn't know he was thirsty until she came out with this pitcher of cold water. Or that somebody helped before. Hi. That somebody, you know, where have people helped you, and where do you help others? And bringing that principle into not just the imaginative realm, but actually out into the world.
Making connections. That's a big deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the conversation can become really interesting.
Rich,
And
yeah.
because you're living with him, and that conversation doesn't have to be contained within the main lesson. Conversation can draw you
Branch
out
out.
into the world, right? So making it real, getting it down on paper. So all of those experiences are, you can find lots of different ways to express the principles of the stories through drawings, through paintings. And that is something that people have asked me for, so I will be doing some lessons for painting lessons. Through sentence writing, right? And also you can do the beeswax.
Oh, yes.
So you can have opportunities for the child to make a figure or make a picture of a picture, make a molding of a pitcher or of a bowl or a shoe or some part of that story. You might not do a book page, you might do a play or a puppet show, or there's this activity of making it have a life of its own. As a human being, to make something have a life of its own is in the realm of the will, the activity that you want, everything that you're working on, to find some way of making it tangible in some way, right?
Sorry, my kids are so loud. Nandi especially.
That's okay. I know mine. So then there's the other part about your skills, because all of this beautiful work that we're doing, you still need them to be able to have beautiful handwriting and neat and following through and answering to the sort of demand of being a student. And there's always time for you to pause and bring those things in, to do math, to do spelling, to do handwriting. The division of the main lesson itself, if you're working with the rhythms of the day, you want to set the time for the circle, the time for the story. So give yourself 10 minutes for the story, or 10 minutes for the recall, and 10 minutes for a new story, and then say 25 minutes or 30 minutes for them to do their book work. You're going to have a few more minutes here or there. So before they do their book work, you might say, today we're doing writing in our book, but we want to spend time on these 2 letters, which your child is having a hard time forming those 2 letters. So you pull out your handwriting book and you spend 5 minutes on them focusing on how to form the letter E or how to form the letter M. Especially at this age, if the child is forming the letters from the bottom, if they do an E like this instead of an E like this, you need to spend time with them being reminded and reminded and reminded with each E that they make, that you start in the middle and you go straight across and then you come around. You don't start at the foot, you always start at the top.
Right.
Your A's always start at the top and come around and then land on the ground.
Right.
So you have time to do that. And you can't do it all, but you focus on 1 or 2 things within that 5 minutes. If they're doing book work, so when a child puts a border on their page and it's all wiggly, you might one day say, before we start, we're going to talk about our borders. And we're going to look at how we've done borders before. And I'm going to show you how I want you to do your borders from now on. And you take your time and you show them how to make a straight border. And then they try it. So you're bringing awakeness to that activity. Because prior to that, They weren't awake to the value of it. You're bringing more value to the qualities of that border. Whereas before you might have just said, make a border, and they just made a border. But they didn't know that, oh, neatness counts. Neatness makes more beauty. And we want our books to be beautiful. And that's the principle you would bring. We want our books to be more beautiful, and here's a suggestion. This is the way I'd like you to do it. If your handwriting is a little wobbly, you might say for a period of time you actually use a ruler and you draw pencil lines. Or you, in some of the second graders, they'll use the block crayon and draw straight lines across with the block crayon in different colors so that they can show the forming of the lines, the forming of the letters, where some go above and some go below. And I can talk with you about that too if that's helpful.
Yes.
Because that will give them form in which to create their letters. It gives them boundaries, like we were talking. It gives them boundaries to say when you're forming your letters, your letters can't go like this across the page. They have to go straight across. Because as they get older, they should be able to write their letters on a page without lines. But that's a step-by-step process. You can't ask them to do that if they haven't written without a line before. You start with something for them to put their feet on the ground, and then they can grow from there. So these little skills you can do in between here and there. If you want to do math, you can do math in their circle game with rhythmic exercises with their multiplication tables. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. And you do it like a clapping game, so that they can do it with you as they're going through just the rhythm of the multiplication tables. And that you should do regular, just all the time, just to keep them flexible and fluid with those and build up. So you do the easy ones first. You do the 2s and the 10s and the 5s, and then you get more complicated. You do the 4s, and then you do the 8s, and then you can do the 11s. Those are good ones, right? And then you have to do the more difficult ones, and those take time. And you just have to work on them every day, just a little bit, and work on them again every day, just a little bit. And there's a really great book about active arithmetic or something like that. That's a Waldorf publication. And they have some games and things there for moving and stepping. You know, one of the things with adding and subtracting with second graders is I actually put little stickers on the floor in the classroom that are from 1 to 25 or so. And so when we did adding and subtracting, they would actually, plus would walk forward and minus would walk backwards. So 3 steps forward and 2 steps backwards, and what number are you on? And if you go 6 steps forward and 3 steps backwards, what number are you on? So there's actually a physical experience of adding and taking away, right?
Yes.
And if you're counting by, there you're making leaps down your number line, right? So those are just easy things to get it in their body, to get them moving in their body. Mental math is also a really good way too when you're driving in the car. We were talking about squirrels, so there were 6 squirrels and each squirrel ate 4 nuts. How many nuts got eaten? Right? If you've done the 4 times table, or you can, keep it in your 5s. We had 5 squirrels and each squirrel ate 5 nuts, and build from there. You can talk about frogs, you can talk about snakes or worms or any kind of nature objects that can eat things or share things or jump on things. I talked about frogs on lily pads and So I had 12 frogs on a big lily pad and 2 jumped off. How many were left? And 6 more jumped off. How many were left? And 2 more jumped off. And then 4 jumped off. Were there any left? You know? So that those kinds of things is an imagination.
Right.
So that they can live in that. And they use their fingers. In 2nd grade, they're still using their fingers, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's totally okay. What we did then is, after you do the mental math, in those 5 minutes, you have a piece of paper, and then you say, we talked about those 12 frogs, and they jumped off, 4 of them jumped off. How many were left? Can we make that into a number sentence? What does that number sentence look like? So you might do 3 of those number sentences from the mental math. That was a little bit earlier in the main lesson, during the circle time, or as you're transitioning to story or something like that. Before you do the bookwork, you have them take out their, quote, math book, and in the math book, you review those questions that you did there, and you say, what's the number sentence, and then you have them write number sentences. So 12 minus 4 equals 8. And another one, you had 6 left and 3 jumped off, so 6 minus 3 equals 3. Oh, 2 jumped on, so 2 plus 3 equals 5. And you just do that, and then you say that's enough of that, and you move on to the next thing.
Okay.
Don't belabor it. That's the great thing, is that you can revisit it every day. And then when they take out their math book, you can say, well, read the sentences that we wrote last week, or yesterday, or the day before yesterday, or whenever you had a chance to do it the last time, so that they're also reading math and understanding what the symbols mean.
So for the main lesson, you said it's a 2-hour block, and each segment is 5 minutes.
Well, here's another chart.
Okay.
So here, as the group grows older, the amount of time that you use for each changes. Okay. So in the 1st grade, the amount of time for circle activity is great. Most of the main lesson is movement activities, but very quickly it's less, because you're beginning to develop their memory forces, you're beginning to develop their talking forces and their ability to express themselves. So a lot of that doesn't have to be so physical.
It's more verbal.
But there's more verbal, there's still more activity between the children, but in your case it's just one, but there's singing, rhythm, music, those kinds of things you just don't want to get rid of. Poetry, recitation, and memorization is also really something that you can do during that time. Then there's recall, and in the 1st year, it's not so much. You want them basically just to retell the story. What happened first, what happened second, what happened last. As they gradually get older, you want them to develop more conversation. What did that mean? How does that relate to yesterday's story? How did that character feel? What are the things that happened over time? That there's more of a sense of conversation about the subject of the story. So the older they get, the more time you will spend on that. Because the more time you spend on this, the more fruitful their working time will be. Because if you really re-enliven it in their feeling, then the willing is easy. If it's not living in their feeling, then writing a story is going to be very difficult. So you want to really re-enliven that. And the older they get, the more writing they're going to be doing. Okay? Presentation, your presentation, basically stays the same, but it becomes deeper and richer and fuller. Your presentation, your story will have more details, more facts, more things they need to really remember, because you're going to become more, quote, scientific in your presentation. In 3rd grade, where you're teaching farming, you want to really give them more details. And in 4th grade, when you do animal studies, you really want to give them a lot of detail about that animal and their personality as a being on the earth, and what their relationships are with the other animals and what the ecosystem is like. It's much more, there's more factual experience that you're bringing, but through the story. And then in the middle school, it's very full.
Right.
You're their textbook in 8th grade. You're their textbook in 7th grade. So if you want them to learn about European history, you gotta really study. I mean, it's 7th and 8th. I admire 7th and 8th grade teachers because they really have to know their stuff. And then as they're doing their book work or individual work, such as drawing or writing, or actually just bringing the material into a presentation on the page, they're going to need more and more time the older that they get. Here, their work is in 1st grade, their work is very simple. So it's just easier for them, and they're just actually just copying what you've done.
Right.
You create the example and they copy the example. Whereas even very quickly in 2nd and 3rd grade, they'll say, oh, can I add this? Oh, can I put that in? Oh, I remember this from the story. What color was their hair? Oh, I want to have that, and I want to have a hat, and I want to have special shoes, and I want to put clouds in the sky. And you might not even have thought of those things, but they will need time to add those extra things into their work. Yeah, so that will increase in time, over time. So you want to dividing up the time. If you have 2 hours in the 2nd grade, I would say a good 30 minutes, 25 or 30 minutes is in movement or singing or music or games or activities, not sitting in a chair.
So the first 30 minutes?
I would say about 30 minutes in 2nd grade. I mean, if they're singing or reciting poetry, they should be standing. I do beanbag tossing, hand clapping games, circle dances, poetry, standing, but moving arms and moving legs and walking or gesturing in different ways. And then after that 30 minutes, you might have just a few minutes break if they need to use the bathroom or have a drink of water. And then they sit down and they do the story at that point, the recall for the story. I have also gone fairly quickly into math then, where I'll do those number sentences that we talked about right after they've done the circle, just so that they can recall them more easily, and we write those down, and then I'll tell the story. Or I did a little bit of reading with this group that I was working with last week, where I was working with letter blends. So I had ch and sh, and then I had some ends of words. So I got like op and in and and ah and e, and so then they would see which ones matched to make words, and then we wrote them in their book. So sh would be blue and op would be red. So they would have a visual ability to see that sh goes together and op goes together. Shop. I had several good readers in the class.
They were able to connect.
They were able to do it, and then I had new readers. But that met both of them, because even though they could read it, I'm bringing their consciousness to the spelling of it. Sh, when you say sh, sh is always sh, always. So they're beginning their spelling lessons through those activities. And that's just 15 minutes. Then I move into the story, or the recall of the previous day's story, and then the new story. And then the last about 30 minutes is then their working time.
Individual.
Yeah, working in their book, putting the material in the book. Now, it's not going to be totally individual with 2nd grade. You are going to either be drawing the picture, parts of the picture, and then letting them do that part, and then you add more, and then they do it. Or you could have prepared the picture ahead of time and just prop it up and say, this is how you work through it. Or I did it different ways with the group. I drew it with them telling me what to draw. Oh, in this story of St. George, he killed the dragon. So we want to have St. George, okay, what kind of colors does he have? So then they can be active in the drawing process. Then I'll have a completed one, and then I let them free. And I don't have to hold them back in some ways by my drawing, their drawing, my drawing, their drawing. I've drawn in front of them. They saw the steps and stages, and then they can go through it themselves. Mm-hmm. So there's a little variety in how you present the drawing process.
Okay.
If you're going to have them writing, it's always good to have it written first on a chalkboard or in your book, so that when they're copying, they can always be referring back and forth. I don't know, do you have a chalkboard in your house?
No.
On your wall? If
No,
you have one
I
that's...
was not prepared for
Okay.
homeschool.
That's fine. If you write it in a book or write
But
it on a piece of
I
paper,
have a chalkboard. It's small though.
that's fine.
Yeah, I think it'll work. I do have chalkboard. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that definitely is something when they're writing for the first time, then they might be able to read just fine, but the writing is very difficult.
Right.
And so they will need something to copy, and
Okay.
you might actually need to point to every letter as they're copying, so
Okay.
that they can know. Because first grade, they just get an introduction to the letters and some
Right.
basic writing, but they're only using block letters.
Right.
I'm not sure if your teacher taught the lowercase letters.
I think
I
so.
believe she did.
Mhm. Okay.
Miss Thomas. Yeah,
So
'cause I
then-
was looking at his book. Yeah, they
Okay.
did quite a bit.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So then it might not be so difficult for him as he goes along.
So he was writing pretty well
Great.
after first grade.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to re-enliven it with him.
Yes.
And, but I always, until the middle of third grade, they only write in their book what I've already written that they
Okay.
copy.
Okay.
If they tell me what they want me to write, so they've enlivened the story and they're going to say, George fought the dragon, I will write George fought the dragon in front of them so that they can see how I form the letters, and then they do it after me.
Okay.
So that
It's
there's
a lot of
real
modeling.
It is.
Mhm.
You're modeling all the time in
time.
these grades.
Yeah.
And take the time to do that, because those steps are really important.
Mm-hmm.
The forming of the letters, where you start, how much space you put in between each word. All of those are habits that you want to really cement.
This way you're really teaching them. It's really, yeah.
Yeah, because in the future, then it will become habit,
Right.
and then they don't have to even think about it, and their habits will be strong
Right.
because you've taken the time to really set them straight at the beginning.
True.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, the last one is just understanding that the block is an orchestral piece that comes to its fruition at the end, and there's a lot of practice in the middle. So there's no, Rebecca this morning was a recovering perfectionist, and so we talked a lot about that when you're working with a young child, you have to hold that outside the room.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be living in the learning process with them. And when they're misbehaving or back-talking or bucking up against you, there's a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And take the time to unpack it and really say, what's going on? What's standing in your way? What's making you feel this way? How can I help you? What is it that we can do to make it a little bit easier for you? Now, with your daughter, sometimes you just have to encourage her and say, you're doing just fine. And she'll say, I can't do this. I don't want to do that. I don't know how to do this. And you're like, look, you just did it. You know how to do this.
That's your daughter?
And
that
so,
sounds like Namdi. That's just 7.
Yeah. So that you begin to know their reactions, and you want to encourage them to just keep moving forward, or identify, well, why is it that you're not going to say this out loud, but you want to ask them in whatever way you can, what is it that's causing you to be afraid? Because the reaction, the bad behavior is really just either the instructions weren't clear, they don't have any way to engage right away. You might need to model something in a more specific fashion for them. Again, go back to what they know, give them context for what they're being asked to do. Do you remember yesterday we did this? Today we're doing the same with this new change to make it even better, so that there's this building process. Now, if they didn't really get it yesterday, there's no reason for you to not do it the same the next day. Do exactly the same. Use the same pattern, use the same instructions to do the same thing until they're like, okay, can we move on now? You know, like they're
Mastered
ready.
It,
Yes.
Mastery.
And mastery really is one thing
Yeah,
too
I see that.
that you really want to focus on.
Important,
Because in these early grades, those habits that you spend time with are the ones that they can lean on in the future when the material gets bigger, the material gets more complicated. It's really habits for life at this point. And the more time you take to do that, the better. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I like that. Yes, I can do this. I can do this. So those are my points.
Thank you so much.
We can continue this conversation.
Yeah.
We can talk on the phone. I can come and see your home. I can help you set some things up. I work currently at the Anthroposophical Society bookstore in Manhattan.
Okay.
And so I can order things for you, books and materials as well.
They sell these books?
You can, yes, you can also.
They filled up that book last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they can, I can order these books. I can also order materials for, like storybooks for you.
Okay.
That I can recommend. We can order them, and or you can do them online. I can send you lists of books online.
Okay.
Yeah. If you go to my website, Managing Your Teaching, there I have my fees listed there, so that you can make some decisions about.
So are you consult?
I am.
Oh, nice. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. That's great.
Yeah.
One word, Managing Your Teaching.
Yes.
.com?
Yes.
Okay. This is awesome. This is great. Okay.
We can build a plan for you. We can decide whether you want to do the Christophorus one or the live education one.
Because I have a 5 and a 7-year-old.
Right. Yeah. So you have different things to do with the 5-year-old because they're not having any intellectual activity, but you can do stories and games with them as well.
She loves
hand clapping games, things like that.
Yeah.
You would work with the Waldorf curriculum, and the Waldorf schools is overseen by an organization called OSNA, which is the Association of Waldorf Schools of North America. That's for the grade school and the high school. But the lower early childhood is WECAN, which is the Waldorf Early Childhood Association of North America, I think. WECAN.
I'll look it up.
And they have a whole website that will give you lots of great support, and they have tons of publications of songs, finger games, poems, poetry, I just said that, poems, songs, stories. That was the word I was looking for.
Okay.
Stories that are appropriate for a 5-year-old.
5-year-old.
Because the stories that you're telling to your son are not going to be, they're going to be nurturing and supportive, but not in the way that an early childhood story would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to make it age appropriate.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Good. Do you have any questions?
No, I think I'm good. Just where to start. Like, I know all the pieces, but
Yeah.
when I wake up this morning, what do I teach her today?
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Well, what you would need to do is look at your whole year. And if you go on Facebook, Managing Your Teaching, there I have a 6-video workshop that most teachers do in the summer because they're getting ready for the year in the summer. And that is how to plan your year, how to really look at all the things that you're meant to be teaching, and how do you put it on a calendar. Because the sooner that you have it on the calendar, you then know you can lean on that. You can really
like
lean
a curriculum guide.
Well, you get the curriculum guide from your homeschooling program, or if you do at Sunbridge, you could do in the summer, they offer introduction to 3rd grade or introduction to 2nd grade. And so there they teach you, these are the stories that you're going to tell. These are poems that you could use, and this is the math that you're going to teach. And they actually walk you through it. And then if the teacher is prepared well, they say, and here are the books that some of my students made during the 2nd grade year. So you actually see what 2nd graders can accomplish. After completing that training, which I recommend to homeschooling moms and dads, because it's broad brushstrokes and you have a feeling for what that year is going to be and what needs to be accomplished during that year. You then have all this wealth of experience, and then you have to put it on the calendar, and you have to say, I have saint stories, I have fables, I have 2 blocks of math, I have nature stories, I have form drawing. When am I going to teach all of these things? And in these 6 videos, I take you step by step. First, we do the calendar for the year. When are you going to take your holidays? When are you going on vacation? When are you on? When are you off? And then from that information, you can then create what's called an outline for the year. And that calendar is just 1 box for each week. So then you have broad brushstrokes of saying, well, these 4 weeks I'm going to do fables, and these 4 weeks I'm going to do math, and these 4 weeks I'm going to do form drawing, and these 4 weeks I'm going to revisit math, and these 4 weeks I'm going to do saint stories, so that you have it all blocked out. And then you have another calendar, you keep breaking it down. So then you have another calendar where you then have a month calendar, and you say, this week I'm going to tell these stories, this week I'm going to tell these stories, this week I'm going to tell these stories, because you're getting more and deeper into and the Christophorus or live education actually lays it out for you. Say, tell this story first, and that story next, and this story, and by putting it then on the February calendar, you will know in January you should start reading these stories and living into these stories and getting a feeling for what your next block is going to be like.
So interesting, because I teach world history, and like in my head, the entire year is in my head. Like I can teach it. I don't have to look at a book, anything.
Yes.
But this,
right. Well, what we're basically doing is
I feel like I'm starting all over.
We're mapping out your year, and so then you can begin to have a brief understanding of what the whole year is going to hold, and then when it's a manageable space and time, and you can sit down and do more reading and deepen your understanding of the topic that you're going to be teaching, then you can be more specific about what you're teaching. I think that's what it is too.
Like, you have a head start. You're a teacher.
Well, you know what you know where you're aiming.
Yes.
That's a long time in your future. How long have you been teaching high school?
I've been teaching for probably 20 years.
Okay, so it's wonderful that you have that in you, and that's here. Yeah. So you can focus this time on creating a new form for your children. And
I just never wanted to teach elementary. Isn't that interesting how the universe just kind of...
Well, you have new capacities to develop.
I do.
And so I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here.
So I would say, if you have the time, each video is like, sometimes they're only 25 minutes and sometimes they're 40 minutes. It depends on what I'm covering. And you can speed through them if it's, like, oh, I get it. I don't need to go through all the steps. I understand what you're talking about. You go to the Facebook page and you click on the link, and that will give you give me your email address, and then through MailChimp you get almost immediately the worksheets that I
Okay.
talk about in the further videos.
Okay.
And in the end, I think it's in the 5th video, we talk about building a binder. So you actually have a binder that has tabs for all of your blocks and your information for each of your blocks in it. So if you have that already from live education, so you don't need to accumulate that kind of work. It's already accumulated for you, so that when it's time to teach that block, all you have to do is unpack that book and put it in the different places and mark it on your calendar. Now I'm going to do this and this and this, and then I'm going to do this and this and this, and then this and this and this. And then
to be more organized. Like
then
that.
you can
Makes
lean
you
on that, and you
sort
don't
of
have
take
that.
a deep breath.
And you can.
I know what's coming.
I know it's coming, right? Because often the transition from one block to the next is really stressful, because you're like still trying to culminate this first block, and at the same time taking in new material for the next one. So then you have backspace and front space.
So when you say block, you're talking about, let's say, moving from fables to poetry. That's what you mean? Okay.
Yeah, so you would be moving from fables to math.
Okay.
It's always good to do something that's more in the imaginative space to something that's more in the real space. To something in the imaginative space to something in the real space.
The rhythm.
So there's a feeling of language arts, then math, then language arts, then math, then language arts and math. And again, that gives you that same sleep awake, sleeping between each one. But then in the language arts, there's still kind of a dreaminess in the language arts. It's not abstract.
No.
It's actually very clear.
Okay.
Math is more abstract because that is more dealing with things that aren't real. They're more ideas.
Yeah, but isn't it more concrete though?
But it can be more concrete because you're actually using manipulatives and doing things in front of you.
Okay.
But it's more incarnating. Math brings them into their thinking much more quickly.
I get it.
And language arts brings them more into that imaginative space, out into the world. And math brings them more into this experience. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. So then if you're doing nature
teachers and how
so if you're doing nature studies, which is more about science, because what you're trying to do is have them observing the outside world, but it's more concrete because they're actually going out and observing the world and seeing the world. So science, so you would have language arts, nature stories, language arts, or saints. So you would do saint stories, math, fables, nature stories, saint stories, math, fables, nature stories.
So you're really focused on math and
math
English
and language arts.
arts, as opposed to social. I mean, the science piece can come from nature and doing gardening or what have you. But what about the social studies?
Social studies comes through the stories, such as saint stories, because you're teaching moral life through the stories of the people that are in the story. As far as history and things like that, in the Waldorf school, we don't really start history until 4th grade. When we do local geography, and then you're teaching history of the where you are. So in 4th grade, we taught Long Island. History of Long Island, from the early peoples all the way to present time. And simultaneously you also teach them about geography, so looking at maps and exploring their neighborhood and exploring their home, and it's really quite an interesting dynamic block, that one, the local history and geography. But you still want to try to keep the child still a little bit in this protected home of real life imagination and real life. Social studies, as far as government and history and things like that, doesn't come until 7th and 8th grade when you're.
Yeah, because I looked at I don't know if you've gone on Engage New York. No. To try to get, they have some good fables there too that I downloaded that I won't use. but they're teaching about Abraham Lincoln. I'm like, are they learning about Abraham Lincoln in second grade? That's
No.
like so much.
No, Abraham.
And the Civil War.
Yeah, that's
So I
seventh.
didn't-
That's seventh and eighth. They have no context.
I know, it's like so much.
Yeah.
And anyway.
So we
it's
don't in
just-
Waldorf. We don't teach that until 7th and 8th grade.
Yeah, I just think it's too much.
Yeah.
So I'm
You-
not
you're-
gonna touch it.
Your intuition is good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna touch it.
Yeah, you should.
And Greek civilization.
That's
and
5th grade.
It's too much.
5th grade in Waldorf is Greek.
Okay.
Ancient civilizations and Greece is in 5th grade. So you teach India, Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt. and
I'm
Greece.
teaching that now to 9th graders
Yep.
who learned it in elementary school, and they're like, I don't remember any of this.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
Because they didn't learn.
Because they
with the
didn't really
recall.
learn it. Yeah.
right.
They
It's
didn't
like-
live into it.
They didn't live into it. They didn't live into
And so in 5th grade, when the child's ready to really, because 4th grade we've taught local geography and this beginning of history. So then they get a feeling for what history is. Like, how long ago were these civilizations happening? That doesn't awaken until they're 11 or 12 years old. There's actually a shift in their consciousness, which allows them to have memory that goes back. They're lived long enough to really know the far distant past in their own life, and they can know the far distant past in human life.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Whereas now your son probably doesn't even remember what he did last month. You know, there's like,
Yeah. Well, last night.
yeah. So the memory forces are we're still trying to build
Develop
those and develop
Okay.
those.
Got it.
And if they don't have memory of their own life, they're never going to be able to engage in the process of recalling memory of history
No.
and humanity.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go with my intuition.
Your intuition is really good. You're spot
Yeah.
on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So try to keep it as real as possible.
Okay.
And also work with responsibility with him. You know, I was looking to see if I can find this page in here that I have, because it was really important that
Oh my God, I could never have a book like that.
the tasks of the teacher are fostering gratitude, building a mood of reverence, creating spaces for grace, where the gifts of the world can be come towards you, right? Modeling intercommunication, proper, healthy intercommunication among people, and the goodness of God, whatever that means for you. Fostering love, the love of nature, love of fellow human beings, chivalry, which is a love of strength and courage and doing the right, doing good, beauty of God. So not just the goodness of God, but now the beauty of God, so that there's a sense of all creation has beauty of all kinds. Even the things that might be uncomfortable still have beauty in them. And that a child, and actually helping them understand that a child needs to be guided. They can do things themselves, but they need boundaries. They need an adult to help them to know what is safe and not safe, what is true and not true, what is good, not good. And then fostering duty, responsibility, and helping them learn the rules, and also restraint, inner restraint. So what does that mean? That's a big word. What does that mean? But you do that in little bits and pieces. Being able to be controlled of themselves, to be controlled of their things, to be controlled of their relationships, to be in, it's not to say to be tight, but to be aware that they're in control of those things. They can be in control of those things if they choose to be. This takes precedent over learning their multiplication tables, because this is what's going to make them a human being in their future, and attract friends and attract life that is good and strong and meaningful, if we can give them those things.
Yeah.
So that's all I have to say.
Facebook
Wonderful.
people.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for opening your home
You're
to
welcome.
us, to me,
You're
and
welcome.
having us here. Thank you so much. This
Will
has
you
been really
press the
helpful.
red button, please?
Yes.